Did it work?
Thank you, Ricky.
There we are. And now for something entirely different.
Hi, Vint. It's great to see
Hi,
you and
Aaron.
be
Good
with
to
you
see
here
you.
today. Super excited to chat with you today. You've been a friend of Z Prime for a long time, but it's been a while, so glad to have you back at one of our events and really looking forward to this conversation on equitable cities and the digital divide. So I just have sort of a general question I want to start with for you. We've been talking about cities, kind of generally in cities, but do you have a specific city that you would consider your favorite?
Well, my wife and I lived in London in 2013, so we fell in love with a little town called Notting Hill, which is in the middle of London. It's like a little town in the midst, a country town in the midst of a big city. And so that's one of our favorite places. If you go a little further afield, there's a place called Castle Coombe in Cheltenham, and that's one of our favorite vacation places. Early in the morning, if you're willing to kind of ignore the parked cars, you get the feeling that you're in the 17th century because the houses are all under some historical limitation, no changes to the exteriors, no matter what you do on the inside. And so you could kind of ignore the cars and the macadam and imagine cobblestones, and I always find that transporting. So those are two of our favorite places.
That's great. I love London too. Last time I was there was 2017, but it was a great trip. It's a really fun city. So what does it mean for a smart city to be equitable?
Well, this is an interesting question. Equitability or equity comes in a number of different forms. One of them is accessibility. From my point of view, a city that is equitable is one which is accessible to everyone. And that has a fairly broad ramification. It has to do with transportation, has to do with communication, has to do with navigation, it has to do with the ability to live comfortably and safely. So the accessibility angle is one important part. Another one is affordability. Um, we see cities like San Francisco as an example. Silicon Valley has created a great deal of wealth, but it's also made the city unaffordable for a significant fraction of the population. And in the earlier conversations where we heard about military bases and we recognized that the support for the military bases is off the base, it's in the city. But if you can't afford to live in the city, then you can't support the military base. So we're seeing this inequity showing up in a lot of different places, and so I think an ideal city is one that's affordable as well as accessible.
And we had a quick prep call the other day, and you talked about accessibility, but that also meaning inclusivity, and not just accessible to people, but ensuring that it's also inclusive for all different kinds of people. So, what are some things to think about when designing a city for inclusivity?
Well, some of those features, I think, came up in the earlier discussions today. Things like access to transportation and in a variety of different ways. And when you think about sort of public transportation, buses and metro and things like that, I always think of that as being inadequate, especially if I think I've just gone shopping and I've got 17 bags full of groceries. Somehow the idea of getting on the bus with 17 bags full of groceries doesn't sound very attractive. So that means that inclusivity means providing a variety of options and alternatives for daily living. That might mean transportation to get to work. It might mean being able to go shopping. How about getting the kids to go to school? How do they get there? Is it safe? Can they walk? So I want diversity of services in a city that's inclusive. And on top of which, I think inclusivity also implies accessibility. So if you're blind or hearing impaired like I am, or have mobility problems, somehow you want a city that accommodates those deficiencies and helps you overcome them. Hopefully technology can have a role to play in making the city more inclusive and more accessible. You hinted in your question about the diversity of the population. And there's something wonderful about a city that has a diverse population. If you think about this area in Washington, you find quite a variety of places to live, restaurants to go to, cultures to enjoy. And I think part of making a city inclusive is one that just gives you a lot of different diverse ways of experiencing the city and participating in it.
You mentioned technology being used to help move along that inclusivity and affordability, and I think that's, one of, I guess, the main aspect of a smart city is using technology and having all these devices that are communicating with each other, different sensors, to help connect people to city services. But that does bring some concerns. So can you talk a little bit about security concerns with IoT and some of the work you've done in that realm?
Well, this Internet of Things, it mostly just means devices that have computing capability and communications capability and either are or can be connected to the Internet. And that's sort of my change of underwear nightmare, because these systems are often built to be as cheap as possible so you can sell them to the consumers, and that often means, well, we'll just grab this operating system out of an open source library and throw it into the device. Maybe you won't bother paying any attention to how to fix bugs in the device, so if you discover a vulnerability, you didn't design it to be upgraded. How do you know when, even if you did design it so it could download new software, how do you know where the software came from? How do you know it hasn't been altered on its journey from the source to the device that's being updated? So technology is your friend here if you use cryptography and digital signatures and other mechanisms in order to make sure that the updates are valid. These are all really important. Now, every one of you in this room probably has a mobile, maybe more than one. And this is another aspect of IoT space. I'll treat the mobile as if it's an Internet of Things. It's one of those IoT devices. I don't know about you, but I'm terrified about how dependent I am on that mobile working. And it's getting worse and worse over time. The other day I was calculating how many different hoops I had to jump through in order to get to an application on my laptop. First I had to log into my phone, then I had to use the phone then I had to log into the laptop application, then I had to use the phone to do the second factor in order to qualify to get into the laptop application. You can see all kinds of single point failures here. Particularly if you don't have a mobile available because the battery's dead, or you're in a location like I was yesterday where you're not allowed to bring the mobile in, so it's not available at all. I worry that we are building very, very complex environments that we are utterly dependent on, but that have cascade failure potential. And earlier in one of the conversations, there was an observation about the complex systems that we rely on every day, as opposed to going down to the stream for water and fishing. We rely on this huge system of supplying food for us, for example. When it doesn't work, there are cascade failure impacts, and we could see that in recent weather events, for example, where you can't move things around, can't update the food in the stores, or you can't get there because the streets are not cleared. So we're living in a very fragile kind of society. And I think one of the things we need to worry about in terms of cities that are habitable is cities that are resilient.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what happens if you get a new phone number and then all the trouble you'd have to go through to access your computer, like you were saying. Or another thing that comes to mind is, I guess, back to the accessibility issue. A lot of places now don't accept cash that I've seen, and I guess you can pay on your phone if you have a phone, but what if you don't have a credit card? And yeah, so there's lots of.
I was at an airport recently. I travel a lot, so I'm at airports a lot of the time. And I needed a cart because we had more than our usual complement of luggage. And I could not get my damn credit card to work with the luggage cart release system. And I got pretty noisy at some point. Finally managed to find another one that worked. But I really worry a lot about this increased fragility, I think, of the systems that we're depending on. And it is true. There are some places where you literally won't take cash anymore. Even it's in the eastern part of China, even the beggars have mobile phones so that they can take donations, so to speak, because cash isn't used anymore. It's amazing.
They have their Venmo accounts set up.
I mean, imagine maybe you have a special app for begging. I don't know. It's an interesting idea.
It's maybe a business opportunity for somebody. Changing the subject a little bit, we've heard a few conversations throughout this event that generative AI keeps coming up. There's been a big focus on that over the past month or so with ChatGPT coming out. So I just wonder, what are your thoughts on generative AI, and do you see that widening the digital gap or the digital divide, or bridging a gap?
Well, I don't know. I hadn't thought about generative AI in terms of digital divide necessarily. It is in both exciting, enlightening, and threatening all at the same time. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen debates right now about how generative AI can copy the style of a musician, a composer, or an artist. And the artists and the musicians are saying, wait a minute, we developed this style, it's our sweat equity. And this damn computer program comes along and makes music sound like us, and we don't get any benefit from it. So there's a lot of argument going on here about where is the intellectual property line and how does generative AI influence that. At the same time, it's enormously empowering because it allows you to be creative in ways that you might not be in any other way. And just like every good graduate student who contorts the professor's question to the point where they can answer the question, I'm going to contort your question into a more general question about machine learning, because we're finding machine learning to be an extremely powerful tool, particularly where what has been learned is based on a statistically stable environment where you can, in an earlier conversation, there was this comment about prediction in order to limit traffic fatalities. And I would say that prediction usually only works in the machine learning world if, in fact, there is a statistical stability to that which is being learned, as opposed to being able to predict the black swan, which for the most part doesn't work. But machine learning has been extremely powerful. Think about the kind of voice dialogue that you can have with Google Home or with Alexa and some of the other applications. Both speech understanding and recognition and speech generation have been enormously improved with machine learning. The same argument could be said for translation. I get emails from people all over the world, sometimes in languages that I don't speak. And, in addition to being hearing disabled, I'm also language disabled because I only speak English and some German and so I have benefited enormously from machine learning translation capability. Lots of other things are now powered by those machine learning algorithms, and they are vastly enabling. So I see them largely, your question about generative AI and more generally about machine learning, I see this more as empowering and closing the digital divide as opposed to expanding it, unless, of course, you don't have access to it. That's a more general problem, which is if you don't have access to powerful tools, then you are disabled in some sense or disadvantaged. And so, once again, this push to make sure that these tools are affordable and available and accessible is important in order to bridge what otherwise could be a very much bigger or growing digital divide.
Someone on a session yesterday said that they put something into ChatGPT, and when it spit out its answer, it was wrong. It had attributed a certain project, an engineering project, to a firm that had not actually completed that project. So, and I think we talked about a little bit the other day too, the amount of misinformation that can be put out there. And it's really daunting, I think, trying to counteract that. So, especially for the normal, just normal person using the internet, how would you say, or is there a way we can try to counteract that or make that more approachable?
Well, let me get my Harry Potter wand out here. Well, look, first, a simple answer is called critical thinking. I mean, if you don't think about where information comes from and are there corroborating facts that go along with the assertions that are being made, you need to ask questions. It's not too different from the scientific method where you have a theory, but you have to test the theory by doing experiments that could invalidate the theory. You need to be ready for that possibility. So teaching people how to think critically about what they see and hear is important, not only for children, but for adults as well. So that's one way to deal with misinformation. The generative AI things absorb enormous amounts of text, and the result is that they're capable of being extremely glib, but those systems have no idea about truth or falsehood, because they've just absorbed whatever the text is, and they're really good at picking what's the next best word for the sentence that they're building. It's pure statistics. They're eloquent, but stupid. So the result is you could easily generate lots of misinformation just out of the pure statistics of the thing. To make it worse, though, forget about generative AI for a moment. There are situations where people either deliberately or ignorantly propagate misinformation. If it's disinformation is very deliberate, misinformation is often not deliberate but ignorantly propagated. How many people just forward things that they saw the headline on and didn't read the rest of the text, say this looked interesting. So we need to do more about identifying provenance of information that we are finding in the online environments, or frankly in every other environment, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, your friends, they're all potential sources of misinformation. And so we need to know what the provenance of that information is, which leads me to imagine that pure anonymity may not be in our best interest, that it is useful under some circumstances, but piercing the veil of anonymity might be needed in order to achieve accountability. And I would argue that accountability is a very important element of dealing with misinformation, disinformation, and all the other kinds of phishing attacks and so on that we bother us today.
So I have a few more questions, but I wanted to remind everyone to put their audience questions into Slido, and we'll take a few questions at the end. But if you've got questions for Vint, use the Slido, please, to submit those. All right, so zooming out, way out, away from cities, away from Earth, into outer space. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with the interplanetary internet that you've been working on?
So we've talked about this in this auditorium before. About 25 years ago, a group of us got together at the Jet Propulsion Lab just after the Pathfinder mission landed successfully on Mars in 1997. The previous successful landing was 1976, the two Viking landers, and then for 20 years nothing worked. So we're all very excited about that. We got together in 98 and we said, what should we be doing now, that is to say in 1998, that we are going to need 25 years from now? And we all concluded we need to figure out how to design an interplanetary backbone communication system in order to support manned and robotic space exploration. Well, here it is, 2023. That's 25 years since 1998. Guess what? We're going back to the moon. The Artemis missions are well underway. The intent is to build facilities on the moon, including things like mines. So now suddenly we have commercial activity being contemplated. We're thinking about how you build an interplanetary system from the technical point of view, but also from the operational point of view. How do you have government and private sector operation of a system like that? Well, the internet is like that. It started out as a government-sponsored system, but it very quickly became a commercially supported mixture. And we anticipate the same thing will happen in the interplanetary communication space. We're not suggesting that we should go off and build this giant interplanetary backbone network and then hope somebody uses it. Instead, we've developed a set of new protocols. By the way, TCP/IP does not work for us in space environments because the speed of light is too slow. It takes 20 minutes for a signal, radio signal going at the speed of light to go to Mars, and another 20 minutes to come back when we're farthest apart in our orbits. And when we're closest together, it's still 3.5 minutes one way, 7 minutes round trip. The TCP flow control systems don't work very well.
Slower than dial-up.
So we are, at this point, we have a new suite of protocols that we've developed. They're being standardized. They are being tested terrestrially with a group called the Interplanetary Network Special Interest Group, which is part of the Internet Society. But we also have prototype software that's been running on Mars since 2004, when the two Spirit and Opportunity rovers landed. It turned out that for a variety of reasons, the original communication plan didn't work. And so we reprogrammed those devices and the orbiters that had gone ahead to map the surface of Mars to supply a store and forward packet switch network. So that prototype has been running since 2004. So this stuff, it feels like I'm on chapter 2 of a much longer science fiction story. I probably won't get to the end of it, but I can tell you it's a hell of a lot of fun being in the first 2 chapters.
That's awesome. Thank you. And what about at Google? Are there any specific projects that you're working on right now that are particularly interesting or exciting to you?
Well, there are a bunch of them that I can't tell you about, but I can say that there's lots going on at Google that you probably do know about. So let me just mention a few. I alluded to speech understanding and speech synthesis, by the way. This is another interesting problem. There are some people who have speech impairments, and we've developed software now that understands someone speaking with that impairment using machine learning and then generates better speech. It's called euphonia, as an example of another machine learning application. There's translation. There's something that we have called the knowledge graph, which has a couple billion nodes in it. This is literally, imagine that each node in the graph is maybe it's a person or a thing, and the links that go out from that are descriptors about knowledge that we have about that thing. So let's suppose the node is Obama. There might be one link that says he's a man, another one is that he's married, another one is he was former president, another is something about his interests and skill sets and so on. So imagine this gigantic collection of information. We use that knowledge graph in order to help us do a better job of responding to search questions, because in addition to what you asked, we also have knowledge that's in the knowledge graph that expands the search space based on the question that you asked. We have natural language dialogue, which I mentioned before. We have navigation tools, Waze and Google Maps. By the way, those are relevant in some sense to smart cities because having the ability to navigate in a smart city is very, very useful. And if the city will supply you with more information about the current state of navigation, that's really helpful. We're investing heavily in quantum computing. We mentioned earlier, you heard about the Waymo self-driving cars. I took a ride in one of them, and I left my fingerprints in the back seat in the first 5 minutes or so. When the car takes off and there's nobody in the driver's seat, that's just a little unnerving. In fact, to be honest, that wasn't what happened because I guess they figured one of the VPs from Google was in the car. They wanted to make sure it was safe, so there was actually an emergency backup driver sitting in the driver's seat, but he didn't touch the wheel. And we drove around for about half an hour in a city outside of Phoenix. And the thing navigated the roads very well, but I was told that the residents in the area hate the cars. And the reason is that they are super cautious. And so the citizens get very impatient about the car that's waiting to make a safe left turn. And they probably create hazards by going around the car. And so, we need to track statistics for safety. Nonetheless, that's an important investment. Precision medicine is another area of real interest to us. The ability to learn enough about a particular individual to figure out how to respond to a disease, for example, using genetic information, for example, and even genetic modification. The mRNA vaccines, for example, are evidence of that kind of thinking. Not that we had anything to do with the specific development of those vaccines. But we have been looking at plant modification as an example. There's a Vietnamese prize called the Vint Futures Prize that has been awarded for 2 years in a row now. It's a $4.5 million operation, $3 million prize for some major scientific and technical investment, and then $3.5 million prizes and one of them goes specifically to a woman. And so the woman that won the prize this year is Pam Ronald, who developed by genetic modification a strain of rice which can survive being submerged for 2 weeks in water. And normally rice that gets submerged, you plant rice in water, it's backbreaking work. But if it gets submerged and then emerges out of it, it usually does not produce the kind of crop that you would expect. So she managed to find a genetic modification that made this stuff survive even if it had been submerged for 2 weeks, and it generated a higher yield by about 30%. So she got a wonderful $500,000 prize. So this work on understanding genetics is another place where Google has investments. So we're a very diverse company, but our main theme is use information processing to make the world better.
Yeah, that's amazing, all the different types of projects that Google has. That's really cool. So we do have some audience questions that are coming in through Slido. Let's see, this first one says, where will the digital divide take us over the next few decades? Will there be two classes of people, those with and those without, and what happens to them?
Well, I hope the answer is no, that we will drive cost out for these kinds of devices and the services that they can offer, the capabilities that they can offer. One of the things that I'm very pleased about at Google is that we've been able to offer an awful lot of capability at no cost to the users because of the advertising model that supports it. So I'm optimistic that we will be able to drive cost out of the devices and the cost of access to information processing services over time so that, in fact, that divide will shrink. There will always be a distribution, though, of people who are wealthier people will have more advanced equipment available than less wealthy people, but eventually things seem to catch up. If you look at how quickly people have ended up with mobile telephones, smartphones, it's pretty dramatic. And so I think that's evidence that the divide can be made to shrink rather than continue to expand.
I think this one goes back to the misinformation, disinformation, and you had mentioned the veil of anonymity. So someone asked, what would piercing the veil of anonymity look like if enacted?
So I want you to think a little bit about license plates. This is not a perfect analogy, but it gives you a sense. Most license plates are just gobbledygook letters and numbers. And so you and I, as ordinary citizens, don't have any way of translating that into who owns the car. Unless, of course, my license says Surf's Up. And so I suppose that gives me away. But I just couldn't pass up the possibility. On the other hand, the police have the ability to look up the license plate to find out who owns the car. That may not be who's driving the car, but it's an example of a way of piercing the veil of apparent anonymity at need. And that's the important thing, is how do you justify piercing that veil? And who gets to do that? Right now there are significant international discussions and debates going on exactly about how to do law enforcement on an international scale in order to hold people and organizations and maybe even countries accountable for what they do in the online environment or even the offline environment. But specifically, there is work going on in understanding how to deal with cybercrime in particular. And one of the things you have to do is penetrate the veil of anonymity in order to hold parties accountable.
All right, so we've just got a little bit of time left. So I'm going to ask you this very, very pressure-filled question, but what is the best life advice you've ever received?
I'm sorry, what is it?
What is the best life advice that you've ever received?
Best life
Advice.
Oh, advice. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll tell you. Josh Lederberg is passed away now, but he's a Nobel Prize winner for discovering recombinant DNA. And one day, this is some time ago now, I was briefing him on what a digital library could look like, and I was very excited about all that. I still am. So I covered the whiteboard with all these diagrams, and I was showing him how all the pieces would work and everything else. And I got all done, and Josh looks at me, and he says, "Vint, do something. Don't just talk about it. Do something." And that was really good advice. The only other piece of advice I've gotten, and which I share freely, is if you want to do something big, get help, particularly from people who are smarter than you are. And I don't mean to insult you. I didn't have any trouble finding lots of people who are smarter than I am to help make the internet happen. And so those are two really good pieces of advice that I'll pass along to you.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great way to end this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, everyone else, enjoy the rest of the day.
Well, thank you all very much.